Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English.
Hi, and welcome back to the English with Kirsty podcast. We have another special guest today. So let's start by finding out who that is. Nick, can you tell us something about yourself, what you do, and what your connection with languages is?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me, first of all. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Nasev. Now, probably have guessed now, if you haven't, that my accent is Australian. I am a translator, first and foremost, of, surprisingly, not so surprising when it comes to my surname, but definitely with my accent, I translate from most Balkan Slavic languages into English. I won't go through the list because there's so many languages.
You can, I'm sure people.
Oh, well, that's one thing. It's the fact that we've got, well, when I was a wee nipper, you could really say, small kid, there were three languages. They were Macedonian, Bulgarian, and Serbo-Croatian. Of course, you can't use Serbo-Croatian anymore. That is now Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin. Four separate languages, which are pretty much the same. So, but don't tell them that. So I translate from those languages. And the other thing that I do, and this is always something I get asked when especially here in the UK, where I live, is they hear the Australian accent. And when I tell people I'm a translator, I often get, what, from English, from UK English to Australian? And I'm like, yes, I do. I actually do that. That is part of my job. I am a adapter of texts and copy from various variants of English, usually US and UK English, for Australian English. So yes, it is a job. It does exist, and I do it.
Okay, so we'll come on to that in a second, but I'm intrigued. Where did you learn the other languages? Was that at school, or was that through your family, or?
That's the thing. I was forced into this, essentially. I've got a rather varied family history in the fact that my mother was born in Australia, and my grandparents and great-grandparents on my mother's side also lived most of their lives in Australia. So that makes me essentially a fourth-generation Aussie on my mother's side. However, my great-grandparents and grandparents could hardly speak English. They spoke, all of them spoke at least three languages, non-English. So growing up, I was in an environment where where no one really spoke English around me as a child. So they were speaking in various Macedonian dialects. There was Bulgarian, there was Serbo-Croatian, there was Greek. So as a child, if you wanted to eat, you couldn't say, oh, I want to eat something, because most of them couldn't even understand English. So I'd have to say, nešto. You had to say it in their language. So I was, by needed to learn these languages. And luckily for me, I found that quite fun. I found that interesting. And I've pursued that since I was a young child, and have done further study to get to the point where I translate from these languages. And I do also know many other languages. I did go to university and I studied Spanish and Mandarin Chinese. But it's always, I always get drawn back to the Balkan languages. It's the thing, it's part of me. So that's where the languages came from. We've always been exposed to the culture as well, whether it be trashy variety shows on VHS cassettes to, of course, more modern days where through the internet and satellite TV, you get to see all the latest shows. And for someone like my father who lives in suburban Australia, for instance, he's stuck in the lounge room, retired, and is constantly watching satellite TV from the Balkans. He doesn't even know what's happening in Australia. So you can immerse yourself like this. And with the resources that I had, I immersed myself as much as I could. And that's where the languages came from.
And that's interesting, because when you're a child, you don't think about, oh, is this a beautifully created sentence? Is this is everything right? I want an ice cream, or whatever it is that you. that you want. And I think that's, the beauty of being a child. You don't think so much, you get on with it. And then as adults, you have to get past that. Sometimes our wanting to do everything exactly right, especially if it's for business, but learning languages should be fun at the end of the day.
Exactly. I find this the problem when I speak with some of my other languages. From when I was a teenager, of course, related to the Balkan Slavic languages, other Slavic languages, and I started learning Russian. And so we're talking about over 30 years of exposure to Russian. I can read it fluently, no problem. But every time I've gone to a Russian-speaking country, and then I, attempt to speak and stuff, because I'm scared of doing mistakes because of the grammar. I'm aware of this, and so, am I going to get the right case ending? Am I using a phrase that's actually used? And it's like, why can't I be like the child I was and just ask for, I want to eat, essentially.
And also, you seem like someone who enjoys talking, as I do. So the more you like talking, the more you have to be able to communicate in the other language. And then
exactly. And when you stumble on that word, I mean, you try and rephrase the sentence so that you can explain yourself and things like that. And you get to that stage where it's like, I just can't explain it. Like, it wants to get out, but doesn't somehow. So yeah, all right. I had one time when I was learning Vietnamese. Don't ask me how to speak it anymore, because if you don't use it, you lose it.
That's true.
Our teacher always used to encourage us to be like a child. Be like a child. Children learn everything, essentially. So he made our classes as silly as possible so that we could actually learn the words and everything about the Vietnamese language. It did work when, asked me 30 years ago about that. And yes, it was working. So yeah, it would be great to be a child. That's the right attitude.
Yeah, I think that's one of the takeaways from today. Like, be more like a child, and then, be curious, be open to make mistakes, and then move on, because who remembers them, unless you're like a politician, you say something really stupid on the news or something, nobody's going to care and nobody's going to remember what you said. So
exactly.
There's that. But moving on to Australian English, then what would you say is some of the main differences between, let's say, British English and Australian English? What are some of the biggest differences that you would point out straight away?
One of the things, I think, of course, the biggest difference is when it comes to speaking. We've got our own unique accent, so on a audible basis, that's where the biggest differences occur. Of course, we love using our noses with these nasal sounds as well. Especially when, I think, the type of Australian English that most people outside of Australia are, well, identifiably Australian and have been most exposed to, are people such as, if we're going back, Crocodile Dundee and then the Crocodile Hunter, who are speaking in what is known as a broad Australian accent. And a lot of people outside of Australia think that all Australians speak like this. When in actual fact, well, I would say that, roughly speaking, I'd say about a quarter of the population does speak like that. You don't hear it as often as you used to. I can tell you, it's becoming, of course, like in most other variants of English, the accents are becoming standardized. So before, Australian had three main accents. We had our broad accent, of course, like, Crocodile Dundee, Crocodile Hunter, yeah, g'day, mate. Then we had, a cultivated Australian accent, very much like a mid-Atlantic one, where people on TV would be speaking like this. And so, of course, perfect example of it was Kate Blanchett used to speak like this. Geoffrey Rush, also Australian actor, he also speaks with a cultivated accent. But actually Barry Humphries, rest in peace, when not in character, because Dame Edna definitely spoke in a more broad accent, but Barry Humphries actually spoke in a very cultivated accent in real life. You hardly hear people speaking like that anymore, but majority of the population is speaking what was considered a standard Australian general accent. And you just have to watch Home and Away, and most of the people are speaking in that sort of accent. So that's one of the big differences. One of the things as well that happens is that you think, I've had enough people tell me it's like, Australian English in terms of writing. Because what I do with my job is that I have to change text from UK English and US English. There's a misconception, first of all, that because Australian English generally uses the same spellings as UK English, that UK English can be used in Australia. To a degree, yes, but only to a degree. There will be words. There are differences in meanings of words. There's unique Australian vocabulary that is used widely. Australian language tends to be less formal, even when writing. So we like using our own slang words, for instance, can appear in newspapers and even in like advertising copy far more often than you would see in, or would be acceptable in the UK or in North America, for instance. So an example of that would be like the traditional Australian practice of chopping our words and putting E at the end of things. So it's like thingies, Chrissy for Christmas,
Okay.
yeah, these type of things that we use all the time. I wrote about it recently on LinkedIn. It's like there's actually no system to it, and you can't do it to every word. So it's something that you need to learn how to use.
It's like a language. You can't just make up your own words, or people look at you like, "What are you talking about?" Or why?
And that's what something as an example that I used was. Last year, when the Women's Football World Cup was happening in Australia and New Zealand, the US team had a tweet where they said that they were training under the lights in Melbourne, which supposedly is their interpretation of what Australians would call Melbourne, the big city in Australia. Outrage. Oh, no way. Wow. There was such, people were flabbergasted. They were absolutely annoyed. It's like, Melby? No one calls it Melby.
What did you do to our city? Yeah.
Yes, like one journalist even said that this anyone calling Melbourne Melby deserves immediate prison time. So yeah,
banishment,
like total banishment. Yeah, which is a bit ironic for Australia, but there's a certain system where there are acceptable words that are used. I think the most famous word where this has actually happened is selfie, which is an Australian word that went international. I don't think
I never knew
hardly
that. Okay.
a language which doesn't use the word selfie these days, which is quite amazing. So yeah, so that's a perfect example of Australian English taking a word, putting an E or making it into a diminutive, and then catching on worldwide. So that's something that's very common about Australian English, and we like using these words on a regular basis. So,
but this place name thing, that works with other places. Is it possible these people have seen that done to another city's name? Or?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where it gets so complicated. So, of course, Melby, wrong. Yeah, you could call it Melbs, but you've got to have the right character to say Melbs and the right time and place for it. Sydney, its diminutive is sitters, but really don't use it. That's my advice. But Brisbane, the third largest city in Australia, is regularly called Brizzy. So
and that's okay. That won't get you.
That's perfectly fine.
Thrown into prison. Yeah. Okay. So you really have to know, or you have to know someone who knows. You don't need to know everything, but you do. If you're creating some kind of marketing copy or something, you need to get it right. Otherwise, you get the wrong kind of publicity.
Very much so.
And I guess if you're saying that British English is more formal, then if somebody did try to write some marketing copy, then it could come across as very like standoffish and like unapproachable if it doesn't have the right tone to it. So it's not just about the words; it's about how you put those words together.
Definitely. One of the, as an example of this is, of course, as someone, I got to learn all these differences, particularly the hard way. Coming from Australia, moving via North America to the UK, and in a very short period of time, living in environments of different forms of English. And that was a baptism of fire, I have to say, where using the Australian English that I thought was universal, every English is exactly the same as this, finding out the various words, and most importantly, the type of language, the tone, the register that is used, whether it be in everyday conversation or in an email that you write to as official correspondence, have different levels in different English-speaking countries. So one example, of course, is that in UK English, please is used all the time, to the degree
Too
that
much, I would say, but yeah. Okay.
oh, please this, please that, please, and also along with that, you would like, would you like? Would this be? There's a lot of conditional sentences there. Would
Would
you
it be
like?
possible?
Would it be possible? Australians don't have time for that, you see. Please, yes, you've got to have a please, usually at the beginning. After that, if you're going to be using please every single sentence, we're like, what's your story here? Cut the crap, really.
Stop wasting my time.
Yes, exactly. Get to your point. We're not US English gets even more direct there. They don't really like please at all. It's too much. It's seen as if you're lowering yourself in a way. But with Australian English, it's like, yeah, we're cordial, but we, all this sort of, oh, would you like? It's too reminiscent of that a cultured English, cultured Australian accent. So since we've moved on from that, using that type of tone is just so not appropriate for Australia. Yeah, they're just, we like to see ourselves as being laid back.
Is that the same with not saying sorry all the time? Like some of my German clients said that's something they notice when they come here to the UK. It's like, why do you say sorry when somebody walks into you? It's clearly their fault, but you're still saying sorry. Why?
Exactly. Yeah, sorry. It's not, of course, we do use it, but it's not to the same degree as you use it in UK English. It's considered to be, too much. It's way too much. Like say for instance you're at a club or something and people smash into you, you don't say sorry, they're in the way anyway, so you just make your way through. So in that respect, when I've been on a very busy tube train and I've pushed people out the way sort of thing, it's a very true Aussie style, I have to say, especially if you've been on a train in Sydney. And I haven't said sorry or excuse me or something like that, and of course it appears to be that I'm very rude.
In London rush hour, that's probably acceptable, but it depends on tourists are.
Exactly. So the register and the tone are very important when changing things. And it's you know what, it might not seem obvious, especially when it's written down, but for someone like myself has lived in these different environments where English is spoken, it's very obvious. I think that's where where the adapters, whether it be into Australian English or any other variant of English, who know their markets, so they know, so you've got people who adapt into UK English or US English, Canadian English, they know their markets so well, and they're able to explain what are the things within the text that the general public would read it and think there's just something off here, but they won't be able to explain what's off. But us adapters and localizers, we know what's off.
Yeah, and people won't necessarily tell you that I'm not buying your products because the way you wrote that just makes me want to go elsewhere. That they will just not buy them.
That's right.
And then they can make an assumption as to, oh, well, the Australian market doesn't want my products, but really it could just be something as simple as just the way you were promoting them. Because I remember I went on a German marketing course because I speak German, and my idea was go on the marketing course in German so it would help me to market my services better in English, which was a good idea in theory, but the course was very much based on the kind of marketing that would work in the US. Some of the strategies and the way of selling things, and it didn't sit right with me. And because most of my clients are in Europe, there's a lot of differences within Europe, sure, but I knew that this wouldn't work for me, and I also didn't think it would work for my clients. So you have to because this was based on an American course, I believe. So it's also about knowing what's going to work, but you don't know what you don't know. And if that had been somebody that, I don't know, hadn't noticed that, they could just take all this advice on board and then wonder why wonder why it wasn't working. But
Exactly.
you have to know your audience, and if you don't, find someone who does.
Exactly. I mean,
so
we've got.
Sorry, I'm just interested to go back to this what you were saying about the cultured accent dying out and not being cool anymore. Was that like an active thing, or did it happen organically, or did somebody say like, why are you doing this? Why do you want to sound like this? And was there like a reason why that changed, or did it just happen?
It was an organic, slow process, let's just say. It really did come about when it's relative to the change in attitudes towards Australia and the way that it perceives itself with its relationship in particular with the United Kingdom. The reason why a cultivated accent really did develop, actually, it wasn't something that, it was present prior to World War II. And it usually was to distinguish people between, I was born in the motherland. So people who were English, British in particular, so it was an identifier, you could say. However, after World War II, there was a rather strange policy in the fact that ABC Radio, so the equivalent of the BBC in Australia, decided that having Australian accents on radio is not fitting for the population because they're not speaking properly, are they? So instead of actually even getting Australians with a cultivated accent, they would import British presenters who had been on the BBC to come to Australia and read the news. So we had BBC accents presenting the news and on newsreels, and then even at the beginning of TV in Australia. Really bizarre. So, of course, you're listening to the ABC. And then, of course, people are listening to us speaking like this. So that attitude and accent, TV accent, you could say, TV and radio accent, this is quite hilarious watching clips from the 60s where you see people actually saying stuff like, oh, yes, I went to the shops yesterday and I bought these items. And it's like, who speaks like that? But, with the microphones being, pushed into their face, all of a sudden there's this cultivated accent. So when during the 70s, when Australia started moving a bit away from the Commonwealth, we adopted the metric system, we adopted decimal currency, and instead of calling them pounds, they became dollars. There was Australia became even more multicultural, so the British element in the population decreased over time. So the ties to the UK were reduced. And so there was a greater confidence within people to actually speak a more Australian accent on television. And I think that was the thing that really changed things there. So by that time, by the 80s, speaking in a cultivated accent was considered to be pompous and even foreign. And the best example of this was Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Alexander Downer, who at the time spoke in a very cultured Australian accent. People actually thought he was English, even though his family is an old Australian family, been around since the early 19th century. That was a vote loser for him, the fact that he was speaking in this cultivated accent. So it's very much a case of a greater confidence in the national identity that actually has caused this change in this change for the way that people speak in Australia.
And so now on the radio, it's a lot more diverse. Different types of accents
yes, you get to hear broad accents way more on the radio. They know the bit of character, especially on commercial TV. The more commercial TV, commercial radio, morning shows, for instance, grab the commuter crowd coming in on rush hour while they're driving. Oh, full on Aussie, I have to say. We're talking about broad accents galore there, I have to say. People relate to it a lot more.
It's more representative of the people that are listening. So why not? Yeah. But you, as a professional working in this area, how do you keep up to date? Because I know you're not in Australia all the time, and also language changes, new words come in, like the words that the 16, 17-year-olds will be using will be different to the words that, other age groups. How do you keep up to date with your language knowledge?
One of the things I do is that I do go to Australia twice a year, and totally immerse myself there. And it's quite evident whenever I do return from Australia, because people are like, "Whoa, Nick, listen
What
to
happened to your
yourself."
voice?
Like, yeah, what happened? What are you saying? It's like, that's what happens when I'm in Australia for 3 weeks. I'm back in.
Come back on the podcast and we can compare.
Oh wow, yes, really. People are like, when I used to work in a subtitling company, this is now 20 years ago, they'd always be waiting to hear, "Oh, let's hear Nick's voice when he comes back from Australia," and then we're like, "Wow, this is stereo." So, so I do language maintenance that way. Of course, the internet and watching the news and seeing. Oh man, there's so many resources these days on the, say for instance, YouTube clips and TikTok, which allows me now and allows anyone essentially to have some sort of an idea of what's being said. However, I think my best resource is my 12-year-old nephew, who he's the one. Oh, he knows. Oh, he tells me words. If I'm stumped on something, I've got it. I mean, I do have plenty of contacts around Australia of varying age groups as well. So if there's anything that's like, I'm, sort of not in touch with something, or if I've got any doubts about something, I can always test it on them and say, "Hey, would you say this? And would that be good?" And so
you sound like a dinosaur. Why are you saying that?
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to sound like as if I'm still stuck in the 80s with the shoulder pads and perm and stuff. But yeah, my best source, I have to say, especially for what young people are saying, is my 12-year-old nephew. He's also in the know, thanks to TikTok, about different forms of slang around the world. So one of his best examples that he gave me, he was talking about how a skate park was going to be opening in his neighborhood, and it was going to bring all the essays. And I'm like,
the what?
What? Yeah, what are you on about? Essays, don't you know? And so he showed me, and he actually then said it's the same as roadmen in London. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know what roadman was.
I don't either. I am an English teacher. I know none of these words.
But yes, I went onto the net, found out everything about what's this whole situation. And not only that, because I was in Australia at the time, I just wanted to know, is this just a local term? Is this something that's only said, like, say, for instance, in his part of his city? So I tested it out. I dropped the term essay when in general conversation with other Aussies, usually complete strangers, to see if they understood, if they were quite normal with the term. They were. So it's like, okay, this is an actual term. And it's essay is a type of subculture, usually young boys they've got a particular sort of chav type of, to use sort of it's like a modern day chav. They've got a certain type of clothing that they wear. They've even adopted a form of Pig Latin as a way that they communicate amongst each other. And of course, they are according to the tabloids, the number one scourge in the country. So,
so it's not a positive term if you use it in that way.
Not at all.
It's not.
Yeah.
Right.
But it was something like, I've never heard the term, but apparently it originated in Western Sydney in the late 80s and has gone national since. So they're the type of things that I get to ask about people. Of course, nothing beats being in the country. You get to find out what people are talking about, which celebrities are the hot celebrities, what TV shows, reality TV shows, particularly people are saying, are they referring to certain things? That's the stuff. So that's why I go back twice a year at least.
Yeah, it's research. It's apart from getting away from the winter here, it's also research.
Oh.
And I guess, I mean, we were talking before we started recording about the size, the different time zones and how big Australia is. Are there a lot of differences regionally in terms of what language can be used? Like, is there kind of a national standard of things that you can say and everyone will understand, or you have to you can use certain words in certain areas, but not in others because no one will understand? Or
Kirsty, I'm so glad you asked that, because for a country that's as big as Australia, just to give you an idea, everyone an idea of how big Australia is, it's as big as Europe minus Russia. Okay, so we're talking, or as big as the 48 states of the United States. That's big. Okay, it takes driving, it takes comfortably, would take about 4 days to go from one side to the other. Are there regional accents in Australia? As much as Aussies would like to say there aren't. The language is extremely standardized throughout the whole country.
Wow. I didn't expect that answer. Okay.
Yeah, that's the thing that's most surprising about Australia is that's such a huge country, and it is so standardized. To give an example, I've been told by the way that I speak, it's like, oh, that's an Adelaide accent. Oh, that's a Brisbane accent. That's a Perth accent. That's a Melbourne accent. I'm originally from Adelaide. That's the in South Australia. The only regionalisms that we have, really, if we're talking about things, some areas have got more broad accent speakers than others, such as Queensland, especially in rural areas. South Australia, for instance, used to have a more distinct accent with, would pronounce a few words differently than the rest of Australia. So, and this would be more towards the cultivated Australian accent. So, for instance, in South Australia, in Adelaide, they've got a radio station, Fresh FM, and it's the home of dance, which makes other Australians laugh because the rest of Australia calls it dance. So these small things, instead of school, as you would like, that's almost like 2 syllables, school, that you would say in many parts of Australia. In South Australia, you say school. So small things. There's, when it comes to vocabulary, people love to like, oh my God, you say these words differently. But I'd have to say that the amount of, it's more the same, like, same interest as like in the UK, whenever you ask somebody, oh, how do you say a bread roll, essentially? Oh, do you call it a bath? It's the same sort of interest that happens, but the amount of words that there is actually a major difference between regions in Australia is just a handful, really. The only other also difference that's been happening over the past 3 decades is that in Victoria, Melbourne, started off in Melbourne, now it has spread to other parts of the state of Victoria, is that the initial E in words is now being pronounced with an at sound. So there are people in Melbourne that pronounce it as Melbourne. And so that has extended also to other words. So there's no difference between celery and salary the way that some people speak in Victoria. But that's it. Really.
Yeah, well, that makes your job easier then, if you don't have to think about that.
Yeah, there's only one of the things, there's difference in words in how you say swimsuit, for instance. And also when it comes to what in the UK are known as trainers, which in parts of Australia you call them sneakers, you call them joggers, you call them sand shoes. However, there are ways of getting around it, essentially. It's just the fact that you need to know not to use the word, say, for instance, trainers for Australia. You just say sports shoes. Yeah, everyone understands that.
Okay. But it's also important to know the words that people don't understand.
Exactly.
Like from being from here, I would think everyone knows what trainers are, but if you don't, then you've maybe lost an important part of your message.
Yeah, exactly.
So I came across you and your content on LinkedIn. Is that the place where you like to be, or are there other platforms that you use where people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm mainly on LinkedIn. That's where I write most of my stuff. And of course, I write a lot about the idiosyncrasies of Australian English, especially the more funny side of things.
Yeah, I like that. I've seen some of your posts and I've learned a lot as well because, it's, we don't think about these things until somebody starts talking about them. So
that's right. Yes. Using the word root in Australia, for instance, is always fraught with danger. So it's one of those innocent things, which always was the thing that whenever we'd have exchange students from the United States and Canada, one of the things that they would often say was that, I've learned very quickly not to use the word I root for a team. So, which would always elicit a huge laughter from the crowd, essentially the Aussie crowd. But yes, I'm mainly on LinkedIn. I do have a blog, but that is currently in the works because a new website will be coming along very shortly. It's under construction. But yeah, follow me on LinkedIn and you'll find out way more about some of the weird aspects of Australian English.
So I'll add your LinkedIn link to the show notes page, and when the website's finished, you're welcome to let me have the link, and I'll add that as well afterwards when it's done, so we don't have a broken link. And yeah, thank you for coming in and sharing with us about Australian English. I learned things I'm sure that the listeners have as well.
Thank you very much.
Have a good time in Australia.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll have a bonzer of a time. Might as well add it in.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.